The door closes behind her with a sound like a verdict, not a slam, something worse than that, a slow, deliberate click, the kind that carries intention. Mary Sutton, 31 years old, her hands still raw from the last season of field work, stands in the receiving hall of the Andover Union Workhouse and listens to that sound echo off the stone walls. She does not cry. She has already cried out on the road before they reach the gate. She used up her tears where no one official could see them. What she could not prepare for, what no one who has not lived it can fully explain, is the moment they take her children. Thomas is 7. He does not understand what is happening, only that his mother's hand is being removed from his. A woman in a gray dress and white cap, the matron, speaks to him in a tone that is not unkind but is not warm, and she leads him through a door on the left. Ellen, who is 4 and still small enough that Mary carried her most of the walk from Overton, reaches back with both arms. Her mouth opens. The sound she makes is not a word. It is something older than words. Mary steps forward and is stopped by a hand on her arm, and she watches the door close on her daughter's face, and the stone hall swallows the echo, and then there is only silence and the smell of lye and boiled cabbage, and something underneath both of those. Something cold and institutional that has no name, but that Mary will come to know as the smell of the rest of her life. This is England. This is 1845. And this, by the deliberate design of Parliament, is how the poor are saved. Stay with this story, because what happened inside these walls, what was done, what was endured, what was permitted by law and by silence, is one of the most consequential and least examined chapters of Victorian Britain. And it did not happen in secret. It happened in daylight, in stone buildings erected at public expense, in parishes across the length and breadth of the country, to hundreds of thousands of people who had done nothing more terrible than run out of money. To understand why Mary Sutton is standing in that hall, you have to understand what the men in Westminster decided 11 years before she arrived there. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 was not an accident or an oversight. It was a policy built on a philosophy, and the philosophy was this: poverty is a moral failure, and to make the relief of poverty too comfortable is to encourage it. The architects of the new system, men like Nassau Sr. and Edwin Chadwick, men who had read their political economy and were very pleased with what they had read, believed that the old parish relief system had grown slack and indulgent. Under the old way, the poor could receive what was called outdoor relief, small payments of money or food given to them in their own homes, in their own communities, allowing them to remain a part of the world while they found their footing again. Chadwick and the commission he served on looked at this arrangement and saw not compassion, but a trap. They saw idleness being subsidized. They saw the rates, the local taxes that funded relief, being squandered on people who should, in their estimation, be working harder or suffering more quietly. The solution they designed was elegant in its cruelty. If you wanted relief from the state, you would receive it inside a workhouse. Only inside. There would be no more payments to people in their cottages. If you were hungry enough, cold enough, desperate enough, you could present yourself at the gate. But once you entered on the institution's terms, not your own. The workhouse would not be a refuge. It would be, by deliberate policy, a deterrent. The principle was given a name that sounds almost reasonable until you examine it: less eligibility. The condition of the pauper inside the workhouse must always be less eligible, less desirable, less comfortable than the condition of the lowest independent laborer outside it. In practice, this meant that the workhouse was engineered to be a place that a rational person would choose to endure only when the alternative was death. And so they came, in their thousands and then their tens of thousands. Agricultural laborers whose wages had collapsed in the years of enclosure and mechanization. Handloom weavers whose skills had been made obsolete by the mills. Widows, orphans, the old and the sick and the simply unlucky. They came because the streets offered nothing, because the fields offered less, because the factories were distant and the winter was near, because a child was coughing and there was no bread. They came to the gates of places like the Andover Union Workhouse, or the Bridgenorth Workhouse in Shropshire, or the vast grim edifice of the St. Pancras Workhouse in London, which at its peak housed more than 1,000 souls in conditions that would make the description of a prison sound appealing. The buildings themselves were designed to make a statement before you were even inside. The architects favored a style that combined the Gothic solemnity of a church with the cold functionalism of a prison. High walls, small windows set deep in the stone, admitting light grudgingly. An entrance gate built to impose rather than welcome. The Andover Workhouse, like dozens of its contemporaries, was arranged in a panopticon-adjacent design, a central hub with wings radiating outward, each wing housing a different category of inmate: men in one, women in another, children in a third, the elderly in a fourth, the sick, if there was room, in something that passed for an infirmary. The separation was total and enforced. A husband and wife who entered together might see each other across a yard at certain prescribed hours. They would not share a meal, a room, or a conversation without supervision. They would address each other, if permitted to address each other at all, in the hearing of officials. The marriage, for the duration of their stay, existed only on paper. Mary Sutton does not meet her husband Edward that first night. Edward arrived 3 days earlier, after the last of their furniture was taken for rent. He had walked the 12 miles to the workhouse and been admitted and assigned to the able-bodied men's ward, where he is currently sitting on a wooden bench in a room with 43 other men, staring at a wall. He has been told he will be permitted to see his wife on Sunday. It is Tuesday. The admission process, which Mary is now moving through, has a bureaucratic thoroughness that feels designed to strip away whatever remained of a person's sense of themselves. She is taken to a room where she is asked to state her name, her age, her parish of origin, her reason for requiring relief. A clerk writes these things in a ledger with a pen that scratches loudly in the silence. She is then required to surrender her own clothing, the dress she came in, the shawl she has owned for 9 years, the boots she resoled twice at her own expense. These are taken, folded, labeled with her name, and stored in a wooden box that she is assured she will receive back upon discharge. She is given in exchange a workhouse dress of coarse blue and gray, striped cotton that scratches against her skin like dried grass. A linen cap, a pair of shoes that were not made for her feet, an apron. This is her uniform. This is, for as long as she remains, her identity. She is shown to the women's dormitory, a long room with iron-frame beds arranged in 2 rows, the mattresses stuffed with flock, a cheap, lumpy packing material that compresses into something resembling packed earth after a few weeks of use. Each bed has a single blanket. The windows are high and small and admit no direct view of the outside world, only a rectangle of sky that changes from gray to black as evening comes on. There are perhaps 30 women in this room, ranging in age from a girl of perhaps 12, who sits on her bed with her knees drawn up and her face turned toward the wall, to an old woman of perhaps 70, who lies motionless with her eyes open and makes no acknowledgement of Mary's arrival. The room smells of damp wool and close bodies, and the particular human smell of people who have been eating the same institutional food for weeks without variation. No one speaks to Mary that first night. This is not hostility, it is something more complicated. A kind of protective silence that the experienced have learned and that the newly arrived absorb quickly. Sound carries in these places. The walls hold conversations, and there are things you do not say in hearing of the staff. What the poor law commissioners had designed and what the boards of guardians in each union workhouse were expected to enforce was not simply a shelter for the destitute. It was a regime. The word is chosen carefully. A workhouse in 1845 ran on timetables and regulations so detailed that they governed not just work hours, but eating pace, movement between buildings, the precise configuration of personal space, and the conditions under which inmates were permitted to communicate with one another or with the outside world. The General Consolidated Order of 1847, which codified what was already common practice by the mid-1840s, specified everything from the dimensions of sleeping space per inmate to the hours at which silence was to be maintained. The men who designed these rules believed, genuinely believed, that structure and discipline were morally therapeutic, that idleness bred poverty and poverty bred idleness, and that the way to break this cycle was to fill every waking hour with directed, monitored activity. The activity was labor, not skilled labor, not meaningful labor. Labor chosen specifically for its tedious, relentless, and exhausting character, because the point was not productivity, but punishment. Able-bodied men spent their days breaking stone, sitting in a yard in all weathers, hammering large rocks into smaller rocks, the chips flying, the dust settling into lungs, hour after hour with a short break at noon for a meal that made no pretense of being more than fuel. Or they picked oakum, unraveling old tarred rope with their bare fingers until the fibers separated into a loose, fibrous mass that could be used for caulking ships. The tar stained, the fiber cut. After a full day of oakum picking, a man's fingertips were raw and bleeding, and there was another full day of it waiting at first light. Women cooked and cleaned and washed and scrubbed, their labor maintaining the institution that confined them. The laundry was a particular circle of misery, great vats of steaming water, the heavy wet weight of sheets and uniforms, the skin of the hands perpetually waterlogged and cracking. Old women who could not manage heavy labor were set to knitting or spinning. Children, and there were always children, the workhouses were full of children, attended a few hours of rudimentary schooling in the morning and were set to work in the afternoon, cleaning, carrying, assisting in whatever capacity their small bodies could manage. The education they received was designed not to elevate, but to prepare. Basic literacy, basic numeracy, and a thorough instruction in the duties and expectations of domestic service. Because domestic service was what the girls were destined for, and the trades or agricultural work was what awaited the boys on discharge. Thomas Sutton attends his first class in the boys' schoolroom on his second morning in the workhouse. He sits on a wooden bench with 11 other boys of various ages and sizes and listens to a schoolmaster read aloud from a primer. The room is cold. The teacher's breath makes small clouds. Thomas has not seen his sister. He has not seen his mother. He has been told by a boy named William, who is 9, and has been here for 3 months, that he will see them on Sunday in the yard, but only briefly and only if the weather permits. William tells him this with the flat effect of someone reporting the weather himself, because this is just how things are, and the sooner Thomas understands it, the better. Thomas is 7. He does not cry in the schoolroom. He already understands with the particular intelligence of children that crying is a transaction that costs too much in a place like this. Keep watching, because what came next, at what was served for dinner, is something that reveals more clearly than any parliamentary debate or policy document what this system truly believed about the lives of the people it controlled. The dietary tables prescribed by the Poor Law Board were not secret. They were published, printed, filed in offices across the country. They specified precisely how many ounces of bread, gruel, meat, potatoes, soup, or cheese each category of inmate was to receive at each meal on each day of the week. The quantities were calculated to keep a person alive and capable of labor. They were not calculated to satisfy hunger. They were not intended to. The gruel that appeared twice daily in most workhouses, oatmeal or cornmeal boiled in water, without salt or seasoning, served in a tin bowl that had been rinsed but not always washed, was the taste of less eligibility made edible. The bread was coarse, often stale. The meat, when it appeared in small and dubious quantities. Cheese was rationed to fractions of an ounce. Vegetables were largely confined to potatoes. In 1845, at the Andover Union Workhouse in Hampshire, something came to light that shocked even the commissioners who had designed the system. The inmates of the workhouse had been set to crushing bones, the bones of dead horses and other animals, to be processed as fertilizer. This was not unusual labor in the workhouse context. What was unusual was what was discovered when investigators arrived. The inmates had been eating the bones, gnawing the rotten marrow from the fragments they were supposed to be crushing, licking the decayed scraps of gristle that clung to the shards. The men and women and children doing this were not doing it from depravity. They were doing it because they were starving, because the workhouse master, a man named Colin McDougall, had been systematically embezzling the food budget, Selling off the rations meant for the inmates and pocketing the difference. Feeding the people in his charge on less than the already minimal amounts the law required. The Andover scandal, as it became known, reached Parliament and produced a genuine inquiry, and the inquiry produced evidence that was, even by the standards of an era not easily shocked by the suffering of the poor, genuinely disturbing. The inmates testified, the records were examined, McDougal was dismissed, and the inquiry revealed in the process a great deal about how the system functioned, even when it was not being run by an embezzler, which is to say, not well and not humanely, and not with any particular attention to the people inside it. Mary Sutton learns the rhythms of the workhouse the way a prisoner learns the rhythms of a cell. The bell at 5:30 that pulls you from sleep, the march to the washroom, the row of basins, the water that is cold regardless of season, the morning gruel consumed in silence. The dining hall rules specified silence during meals because the commissioners had decided that conversation at mealtimes was a form of social pleasure incompatible with the deterrent function of the institution. The march to work, the hours at the wash tub or the scrubbing brush, the noon meal, eaten in silence, the afternoon work, the evening gruel, the bell for bed, every day the same. Every week a variation so minor it barely registers. On Sunday she sees her children. The yard on Sunday afternoon is the 1 hour of the week when the families are permitted to be in the same space together, under supervision, for a prescribed period. Mary walks out into the yard and sees Thomas standing with a group of boys, and sees him see her. And the way his face changes is something she will carry for the rest of her life. He walks quickly. They are not supposed to run, and she puts her arms around him and holds him and feels how much thinner he is in 2 weeks. Though perhaps she is imagining it. Perhaps it is only the unfamiliar clothes, the gray uniformity of him. Ellen is brought out by a young woman attendant, and Ellen sees her mother and runs regardless of the rules, and no one stops her, and Mary crouches down in the yard of the Andover Workhouse, with both her children in her arms, and the gray October sky pressing down, and the stone walls around them on all sides. Edward is somewhere in the other yard. She can see through the iron railings that separate the men's exercise area from the women's, a group of men standing in clusters, their striped uniforms making them look collectively anonymous. She cannot identify him at this distance. She raises her hand anyway in case he is watching. The question that haunts every account of the workhouse system is not whether the people inside it suffered. They clearly did. The question is whether anyone in authority cared. And the answer is complicated in the way that answers always are when large institutions meet human beings. There were guardians, the elected local boards who oversaw individual workhouses, who took their duties seriously and fought with central commissioners for better rations, warmer conditions, more humane treatment. There were workhouse masters who were not McDougals, who followed the rules without embellishment and treated the inmates with something approaching decency. There were matrons who were kind to the children in their care, who understood that the small human beings who arrived at the gate, bewildered and frightened, were still children. Whatever the law said they were entitled to in terms of warmth and food and comfort. But the system was not built on the kindness of individuals. It was built on a philosophy, and the philosophy was that the poor were, in some fundamental way, the authors of their own condition, and that to be too gentle with them was to do them a disservice. This was not cynicism in the Victorian mind. It was, for many of its adherents, a genuine moral conviction, derived from economic theory and filtered through the Calvinist notion that suffering, borne with patience, was instructive. The workhouse was supposed to teach. It was supposed to reform. And if it also broke people, if the men who came in as laborers emerged as something hollowed and changed, if the women who entered in their own clothes left years later in the same coarse uniform they had arrived in, if the children grew up without their parents and without the ordinary textures of love and domestic life, well, that was not the intent. The intent was improvement. The suffering was, in the formal language of the commission, incidental. It was not incidental to Mary. By November, she has learned which of the women in her dormitory can be trusted and which cannot. She has learned that the young woman in the far bed, a girl named Hannah, 18, who came in from Hurstbourne with a baby who was taken from her at the gate, will sometimes at night make a sound that is not quite crying, not quite anything, and that the correct response is silence, because Hannah does not want comfort. She wants the sound to exist without acknowledgement, the way grief sometimes needs to be witnessed without being named. Mary has learned that the morning gruel is marginally better if you eat it while it is still hot, which means eating quickly, which means a certain brutality of consumption that she would have found shocking 4 months ago. She has learned the small geography of permissible movement, the routes that take you past the window where, on clear days, you can see a slice of the road outside. She watches the road. She cannot explain why. Children died in workhouses. The records are clear on this, if clinical in their presentation. Infant mortality in the workhouse infirmaries was substantially higher than in the wider population, a fact that the commissioners acknowledged and explained with reference to the weakened condition of the children upon arrival, rather than the conditions within the institution itself. A distinction that may have satisfied the inquiry, but not the mothers. The infirmaries where the sick were sent were chronically understaffed and undersupplied. A workhouse surgeon might be responsible for a population of several hundred people, visiting perhaps twice a week. Nursing was performed largely by other inmates, women assigned to the infirmary ward as part of their labor requirement, with no training and limited supplies. Infections spread. Fevers ran through the wards. The elderly, whose constitutions had been weakened by decades of hard labor before they reached the gate, were particularly vulnerable. It was not uncommon for an old man or woman to be admitted in autumn and be buried in the workhouse graveyard by spring. The workhouse graveyard. This is something that appears in the records without emphasis, as a logistical note, a matter of interment. But consider what it means. That the institution of the workhouse extended even into death, that those who died within its walls were buried on its grounds, in plots unmarked or minimally marked at the expense of the Union, without the ceremony or the mourners or the particular human ritual of being returned to a community that knew you. To be buried in the workhouse was to be buried as a pauper, and to be buried as a pauper was, in Victorian England, understood as a final confirmation of a life that had failed. People feared it as they feared few other things. There are accounts of men and women discharging themselves from the workhouse while clearly too ill to survive in the outside world, willing to die in a ditch rather than die inside the walls, because dying inside the walls meant being buried in the corner of the grounds without your name meaning anything to the earth that covered you. Edward Sutton is discharged in March. He has found a promise of work, seasonal agricultural labor, enough to rent a room, enough for bread, and the Board of Guardians has determined he is no longer eligible for relief. He has given back his own clothes, which no longer fit properly because he has lost weight. He has given a note confirming his discharge. He is told that his wife and children remain in the workhouse as they have no independent means of support until such time as his income is sufficient to receive them. He stands at the gate in the March morning with his discharge paper and his clothes that do not fit, and the knowledge that his family is still inside the walls and that the gate will not reopen for them until someone in an office somewhere decides the time is right. He does not look back as he walks away, not because he does not care, because he cannot afford to. If you have stayed with this story, if you have stayed with Mary and Thomas and Ellen and Hannah, whose baby was taken, with the men breaking stones in the winter yard and the old women lying open-eyed in the dormitory, then you already understand something that the parliamentary reports and the economic theory could not quite grasp, which is that what happened inside these walls was not a policy outcome. It was a life. Dozens of lives, hundreds of lives, and then thousands of lives, each one as specific and irreducible as Mary's. Each one shaped and bent, and in many cases broken, by a system that had been designed not to help the poor, but to discourage them from needing help. There is a difference between those two things. It seems obvious when stated plainly. It was not obvious in the Whitehall offices of 1834, or if it was not considered relevant. By the summer, Edward has managed to secure a tenancy on a single room in a laborer's cottage outside Andover. His wages are irregular and the room is small and damp, but it is enough, barely enough but enough, that on a Thursday in late July, Mary Sutton and her 2 children walk out of the workhouse gate for the last time. Thomas has the particular too-still quality of a child who has learned to be invisible, a skill he will not entirely unlearn. Ellen is 5 now and does not remember quite what her mother smells like without the lie. She reaches for Mary's hand with a grip that is too tight, as if she has been practicing not letting go. They walk out onto the road and the gate closes behind them, and ahead is the summer and the world and the terrible specific difficulty of going on. The Andover Workhouse continued to operate for years after the scandal. The system it was part of continued to expand. By the 1850s, there were over 600 union workhouses in England and Wales, housing at any given time between 100,000 and 200,000 people. The principle of less eligibility remained official policy. The family separation rules remained in force. The oakum picking and the stone breaking and the gruel twice daily remained the texture of daily life for the people inside. The system was not reformed by the outrage that followed the Andover inquiry. It was modified, adjusted at the edges. The bone crushing was discontinued. The dietary tables were reviewed, but the architecture remained. The walls, the wings, the iron gates, the yards, and the philosophy behind the architecture remained. And the people kept coming because the world outside kept producing more of them. More casualties of the harvest failures and the wage cuts and the cycles of industrial boom and rural collapse that characterized the Victorian economy with the same relentless rhythm as the workhouse bell. They came in their best clothes and left in striped gray cotton. They came with their children and were parted from them in the receiving hall. They came with names and were entered in ledgers. They sat in silence in the dining hall and breathed the steam of gruel that tasted of nothing and picked oakum until their fingers bled and slept under single blankets in rows and listened, in the night, to the sounds that dormitories full of desperate people make when the lights are extinguished and there is nothing left to perform for anyone. Some of them endured it and emerged and made something of what remained. Some of them did not emerge. Some of them died in the infirmary beds and were buried in the corner of the grounds. Some of them emerged as Edward did, thinner and changed in ways that do not have easy names, and went back to their laboring lives and said almost nothing about what they had experienced, because there was no language in Victorian England for a working man to describe institutional trauma, no framework in which such a description would be received as anything other than weakness, and the people who had designed the system would have said that this silence proved its efficacy, that the deterrent had worked, that the man had learned, that the experience had improved him. The bones in the yard of the Andover Workhouse were crushed into fertilizer. The fertilizer fed the fields. The fields fed the people who could afford to buy bread. This is the economy of the system as it actually operated, stripped of its moral language, examined in its material reality, and at the center of it, not quite visible in the policy papers or the parliamentary returns, is a woman standing in a stone hall in October, listening to the click of a door closing on her daughter's face. Mary Sutton is not a person who appears in the records. She is the person behind the records. She is the aggregate of the admission books and the dietary tables and the punishment registers and the coroner's reports and the testimony before the Select Committee on the Andover Union, assembled into a human being who is, in her particularity, in her suffering and her persistence, more accurate than any statistic. There were hundreds of thousands of her. There were hundreds of thousands of that sound. The sound of the door, the sound of the child, the sound of the stone hall swallowing everything. History does not record whether she forgave the men who built the system. The men who built it died in their own beds, attended by physicians, mourned by their families, buried with their names on stones that are still standing in churchyards across England. They believed they had done good. They believed they had served the nation and improved the poor and rationalized the relief of destitution in accordance with sound economic principles. They wrote books. Some of their books are still read. The workhouse bell does not ring anymore, but stand in the yard of one of the buildings that remains, the ones that have been converted into flats or museums or simply allowed to stand in their gray Victorian solidity, and listen to the silence that the stones still hold. It is a particular silence. It has weight. It knows what it has witnessed, even if the witnesses themselves are long gone, even if the ledgers have crumbled and the flock mattresses have rotted and the names in the admission books have passed beyond living memory. The door clicked. The child reached back with both arms, and the stone hall swallowed the echo, and there was silence. And the silence was England, and England did not flinch.